On the bright, windy afternoon of 12th September 1953, on the terrace at Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier pauses for a moment at the edge of her own reception. The orchestra plays under a white tent. Nearly 800 guests have just watched her marry Senator John F. Kennedy at St. Mary's Church, a ceremony the New York Times described that morning as uniting two families prominent in finance and politics. In a side room, away from the crowd, she lifts a pair of dark sunglasses from the table, hesitates, and instead reaches for a fountain pen. There is a stack of cream correspondence cards already laid out for the new Mrs. Kennedy to begin her thank you notes, an old habit from Miss Porter's school, where polished gratitude was as important as French verbs. She adjusts the long white glove on her right hand so it won't blot the ink. Outside, camera shutters flutter like applause. Inside, the bride bends over the first card, already translating the feeling into something presentable. The sunglasses remain on the table. They will be useful later. In the early 1930s at Lasada, the sprawling Bouvier estate in East Hampton, Long Island, a young Jackie rides her pony danseuse across clipped lawns while adults drift between cocktails and tennis on summer afternoons. She is born at Southampton Hospital on 28 July 1929 to John Vernew Black Jack Bouvier III, a Wall Street stockbroker known for his dark complexion and darker moods, and Janet Norton Lee Bouvier, whose own family's Irish Catholic roots are carefully obscured beneath layers of society aspiration. The estate itself, whose Algonquin name means place of peace, belongs to her grandfather, Major John Vernew Bouvier Jr., a successful lawyer who has translated professional achievement into the kind of Long Island property that signals arrival. The house is shingled and sprawling, surrounded by gardens where Jackie's writing lessons begin almost as soon as she can walk, where she learns the names of flowers and the proper way to address the staff, where summer routines of privilege create the illusion of permanent security. Family photographs and home movies from Lasada, later deposited in Kennedy Library archives and reproduced in countless biographies, show a dark-haired child in smoked dresses, already intensely aware of the camera. She poses with studied casualness, one hand on her pony's mane, her expression serious beyond her years. The images capture what they're meant to, a child of wealth growing up in appropriate settings. What they cannot show is the tension building inside the house, the arguments behind closed doors, the drinking and infidelity that will soon fracture her parents' marriage. Jackie spends her childhood shuttling between Manhattan apartments on Park Avenue and this Long Island refuge, between her father's glamorous unreliability and her mother's increasingly brittle perfectionism. She rides. She reads voraciously in a window seat, overlooking the gardens, and she watches grown-up quarrels with the attention of someone learning to navigate emotional terrain more complex than any writing course. In 1936, when she was 7, her parents separated. The event is handled with the discretion expected of their class. No dramatic scenes, no public airing of grievances, just a quiet shift in living arrangements. By 1940, the divorce was finalized, an event the New York Society pages cover as a minor scandal, noting the terms of settlement and custody arrangements with the same attention they give to charity galas and debutante presentations. At night, in her room overlooking the Lasada Gardens, Jackie writes little notes to her father on monogrammed stationery, asking when he will visit next, when they can ride together again, trying to maintain connection across the widening distance. The handwriting is large and uncertain, each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who understands, even at this young age, that words on paper can sometimes accomplish what face-to-face pleading cannot. The instinct to mend emotional distance with carefully chosen written words is already there, will remain there, and will define much of how she navigates relationships throughout her life. The narrator reflects that her earliest and most formative lesson comes not from schools or governesses, but from this dissolution that a beautiful setting does not guarantee stability, that adult promises can be broken regardless of how elegantly they're made, that a girl's charm and good manners and perfect behavior cannot repair damage caused by forces beyond her control. It is a lesson in the limits of performance, learned early enough to shape everything that follows. When her mother remarries in June 1942, wedding to Hugh Dudley Auchincloss Jr., an heir to the Standard Oil fortune whose previous two marriages have left him with children from each union, Jackie's world shifts again. She will spend her teenage years learning to navigate not just one household, but multiple ones, adapting to new siblings, new rules, new ways of performing belonging. After Janet marries Hugh D. Auchincloss, Jackie's life divides between two very different men and their very different worlds. Her beloved, unreliable father remains in New York, continuing his bachelor existence in a Park Avenue apartment. Still handsome, still charming, still drinking too much and pursuing affairs with married women. Her new stepfather offers the opposite: measured order, quiet wealth, WASP propriety expressed through the careful management of two substantial estates. Marywood, the Auchincloss estate in McLean, Virginia, sits on 46 acres overlooking the Potomac River. The Georgian house, built in 1919, contains formal rooms where conversation is carefully modulated, where political discussion happens in tones that assume power rather than demand it, where wealth is displayed through understatement rather than ostentation. Later, when Jackie brings John F. Kennedy here during their courtship, he will find the atmosphere both impressive and slightly suffocating. Old money's preference for privacy and discretion, so different from the Kennedy family's more exuberant Irish Catholic approach to wealth and politics. Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Auchinclosses spend summers, is even grander. 28 rooms sprawling over 97 acres, with views of Narragansett Bay and gardens that require a staff of gardeners to maintain. The farm includes actual working elements: cattle, chickens, the trappings of gentleman farming, but these are decorative agriculture, wealth performing a relationship to land and tradition. Letters and later interviews, preserved in various archives and quoted in biographies by Carl Sferrazza Anthony and Sarah Bradford, suggest that Jackie sometimes feels like an outsider in the WASP Auchincloss world. She is Catholic in a Protestant household, the child of a divorced and scandalous father in a family that values discretion, closer in temperament to her Bouvier grandparents' sense of improvisation and drama than to Hugh's quiet, controlled approach to life. In these big houses, the soundscape is different from what she remembers from Lasada's more chaotic summers. The gentle clink of ice in crystal glasses, the low-voiced dinner conversations about politics and finance that assume understanding rather than explain, the solemn ticking of long-case clocks in entrance halls where portraits of Auchincloss ancestors look down with expressions of permanent judgment. Even the servants move more quietly here, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets, their presence noticed only through results, meals that appear perfectly plated, fires that are lit before anyone realizes the room has grown cold. Janet, determined that her daughter will succeed in this new world, insists on rigorous training in the social graces. Thank you notes must be written for every visit, every gift, every kindness, not perfunctory notes but thoughtful ones that reference specific details and express appropriate levels of gratitude calibrated to the giver's social position. Jackie writes them at a small antique desk in her room at Hammersmith Farm, looking out over Narragansett Bay, her script growing tighter and more controlled as she ages, each letter an exercise in managing appearances. School reports from Chapin School in Manhattan, where she attended before the Auchincloss remarriage, describe her as clever, artistic, and memorably full of the devil, a phrase suggesting spirit that requires channeling, energy that needs discipline. The reports indicate high intelligence combined with a tendency toward independence that teachers find both impressive and occasionally troubling. She is not docile, not entirely tractable, not content to simply absorb lessons without questioning their purpose. The narrator observes that underneath all, the advantages, the servants and the summer houses, the riding lessons and the European travel, the careful cultivation of languages and manners, there runs a sharper instruction in emotional management. Jackie learns early that while emotions may be turbulent, while private feelings may be complex and painful, The letters and manners presented to the world must remain smooth, controlled, giving nothing away. The performance is not optional, it is survival. By the time she arrives at Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, in September 1944, even her rebellion will be discreet, expressed through wit and irony rather than open defiance, through the kind of intelligence that questions without quite challenging, that observes without quite judging. At Miss Porter's school from September 1944 through her graduation in June 1947, Jackie moves through an institution that has been preparing daughters of the American elite for over a century. The campus in Farmington, Connecticut, combines New England propriety with genuine academic rigor, a place where girls study Latin and calculus alongside deportment and ballroom dancing, where intellectual achievement is valued, but not if it comes at the cost of social grace. The school's ivy-covered buildings and carefully maintained grounds create an environment of deliberately cultivated refinement. Morning chapel is mandatory. Table manners are monitored at communal meals. The dress code is specific and enforced. Yet, within these constraints, the curriculum is substantive. Literature, languages, history, science, all taught by teachers who take their students' minds seriously, even as they also polish their manners. School records and yearbooks, preserved in the school's archives and reproduced in various biographies, praise Jackie's writing abilities. She is an accomplished equestrian by this point, having spent years training, her fluency in French, and what teachers describe as her unwillingness to become a housewife, a phrase that suggests both admiration for her intelligence and slight concern about her marriageability. The comment reveals the contradiction at the heart of institutions like Miss Porter's. They educate girls to think critically and independently, while preparing them for lives in which those very qualities might need to be carefully concealed. Her afternoons often involve riding in the Connecticut countryside, where the landscape's gentle hills and stone walls provide less dramatic terrain than East Hampton, but offer freedom from the school's constant supervision. She rides alone when possible, using the time for the kind of solitary reflection that will characterize her throughout life, a preference for her own company over the exhausting performance of constant sociability. Evenings find her at a dormitory desk under lamplight, drafting letters home or working on French translations. The room smells of old wood and floor polish. Outside her window, New England. Seasons progress with reliable regularity. Nothing like the dramatic weather shifts of Long Island summers. The rustle of uniform skirts in hallways, the scratch of fountain pens on good paper, the glow of desk lamps through leaded windows create a soundscape in which discipline and privilege are indistinguishable, where the training of young women happens through 1,000 small adjustments and corrections rather than explicit instruction. During school breaks, she attends her first adult social events in New York, testing the skills Miss Porter's has been cultivating. She learns to move through cocktail parties and dinner dances with the appearance of ease, to make conversation with men twice her age without seeming either overly forward or inappropriately shy, to gauge exactly how much wit to display without appearing threatening or superior. By the summer of 1947, after her formal debut at the Clambake Club in Newport, she had caught the attention of society columnist Igor Cassini, who wrote for the Hearst newspapers under the byline Charlie Knickerbocker. In his column, later preserved in newspaper archives, he dubs her debutante of the year, describing the slim, brunette Miss Bouvier as someone who moves through society parties with unusual poise and detachment, someone who is present but also somehow observing, participating while remaining slightly apart. The designation is both compliment and classification. It marks her as successful within the system while also confirming that she is fully captured by it, that her future has been more or less determined by birth and education, that the path from debutante to appropriate marriage to suitable matronhood has been laid out, and she is expected to follow it. The narrator reflects that the girl who once wrote pleading notes to her absent father now writes cool, amusing letters to friends, recording parties and suitors and social observations with an increasingly sharp eye. She is simultaneously becoming participant and observer, performer and critic, someone who can execute the expected role flawlessly while also maintaining enough internal distance to see its absurdities. She is already, in this sense, half reporter and half subject, a duality that will define much of her later life, particularly during the White House years when she must be both the woman living the role of First Lady and the woman intensely aware of how that role is perceived and judged. When she leaves Vassar College after her junior year to spend 1949 to 1950 studying in Paris, the languages and manners drilled into her at Chapin, Hammersmith Farm, and Miss Porter's will become tools for a more ambitious performance of self, one that attempts to claim European sophistication as a kind of armor against American expectations. In the academic year 1949-1950, Jackie studied in France through a Smith College program that allows students from other institutions to spend a year abroad. She attends classes first at the University of Grenoble in the French Alps, then at the Sorbonne in Paris, living with a French family in an apartment that looks out over streets where history seems to press closer to the surface than it ever does in America. This year represents perhaps the greatest freedom she will experience until much later in life, away from her mother's supervision, from Auchincloss expectations, from the marriage market pressures of New York society. She moves through Paris with the kind of cultivated solitude that suits her temperament. She walks alone through the Louvre and the Rodin Museum, sits in cafes reading French novels, attends lectures at the Sorbonne, where she is just another student, rather than a debutante or an heiress or someone's daughter. In letters home, portions of which have been preserved in archives and quoted extensively in biographies, she calls this period the happiest time of my life, a striking phrase from someone who will later live in the White House and marry one of the world's richest men. Happiness comes precisely from anonymity, from the ability to be herself without constant performance, from the pleasure of watching rather than being watched. She keeps detailed notes on what she observes, how Parisian women tie their scarves with a specific casual elegance that American women never quite achieve, how light falls differently through European windows, how the arrangement of objects in French interiors creates atmospheres of refinement without ostentation. These observations are not idle tourist notes, but serious study. She is learning a visual vocabulary, training her eye, preparing herself, though she may not consciously realize it, for a future role that will require exactly this kind of aesthetic intelligence. Her dark sunglasses appear in photographs from this period, visible in snapshots taken by fellow students, and in more formal portraits. The glasses are large and practical, offering protection from sun but also from the gaze of others, allowing her to observe without being observed, to study faces and scenes without her own reactions being visible. The sunglasses will become, over time, her most recognizable accessory, more iconic even than the pillbox hats or the Chanel suits. A piece of armor that is simultaneously fashionable and functional, performing style while enabling privacy. The narrator notes that Paris teaches her something she suspected, but now confirms that style is not frivolous decoration, but a language, a form of communication and self-presentation that can convey meaning as precisely as words. And she is, by this point, fluent, perhaps more fluent in the language of visual presentation than in the French she is ostensibly studying, though her French is also becoming excellent. When she returns to the United States in the summer of 1950, she completes her final year at George Washington University, rather than returning to Vassar, a decision that reflects both practical considerations — Washington is closer to Marywood — and perhaps a desire to avoid the intense social atmosphere of a college where her status as debutante of the year makes genuine anonymity impossible. In January 1951, now graduated and facing the question of what to do with her education and her life, she entered the annual Vogue Prix de Paris contest, a competition for young women that offers a year-long traineeship at the magazine, 6 months in New York, 6 months in Paris. Her submission includes an essay, technical test of fashion knowledge, and a personal statement about her plans and ambitions. She wins, demonstrating genuine talent and ambition, but ultimately turns down the prize, reportedly after her mother and stepfather express concern that pursuing a career might damage her marriage prospects. The decision, or the pressure that shapes the decision, reveals the limits of the freedom she has tasted. Education is acceptable, European sophistication is valuable, intelligence and creativity are admirable, but they must all ultimately serve the larger purpose of making an advantageous marriage. A career, particularly in something as frivolous seeming as fashion, is not appropriate for someone of her class and expectations. Instead, in September 1951, she takes a position as inquiring camera girl at the Washington Times-Herald, a job that pays $40.50 per week and sends her out into Washington with a Rolleiflex camera to photograph strangers and ask them questions for a daily feature column. It is, in its way, perfect training for what will come next, learning to approach people, to make them comfortable, to extract personality and story in brief encounters, to condense human complexity into a few publishable lines. She is learning to be both charming and instrumental, to use social skills for professional purposes, to turn conversation into copy. The skills she develops wandering Washington streets with her camera, the ability to put people at ease, to steer conversations, to observe and record quickly, will prove invaluable later on campaign trails and state visits, in receiving lines and diplomatic receptions, anywhere that genuine human connection must be produced efficiently and repeatedly under pressure. In September 1951, working as the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald gave Jackie a form of professional identity rare for women of her background. The newspaper, owned by Eleanor Cissy Patterson until her death in 1948 and known for its conservative politics and society coverage, provides a respectable, if not particularly prestigious, entry into journalism. The job requires her to roam Washington with a heavy Rolleiflex camera, approaching strangers on streets and in parks, asking them the question of the day, photographing them, and then shaping their responses into the brief, often witty column that appears under her byline. The bound volumes of these columns, preserved in the Library of Congress in the Kennedy Library, reveal her developing skill at drawing people out, at finding the telling detail or surprising response, at making ordinary Washingtonians comfortable enough to be quotable. The questions range from trivial to substantive. Should a candidate's wife campaign for her husband? What do you think of Senator Nixon's checkers speech? If you had a date with Marilyn Monroe, where would you take her? The format is light, but it provides genuine training in observation and condensation, in the transformation of raw human encounter into polished publishable text. Her small apartment on Connecticut Avenue becomes a private space for the first time in her life, not a boarding school room or a bedroom in one of her parents' houses, but her own territory. In the evenings after work, she sits at a small desk writing notes on cheap reporters' notebooks, ideas for future columns, observations about people she's met, occasional diary-like reflections on dates that went badly or well, fragments of a private self that she is still learning to articulate. Letters from her father arrive periodically, the envelopes often smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and whiskey, the handwriting increasingly shaky as his health and finances deteriorate. Jack Bouvier, still handsome but aging hard, still charming but less successful, writes with the carelessness of someone who knows he has been a disappointment but hopes affection might compensate for unreliability. Jackie responds with carefully cheerful notes that reveal nothing of her own struggles or concerns, maintaining the performance of a devoted daughter, even as the relationship grows more strained. Her mother's letters, by contrast, emphasize propriety and expectation. Janet writes regularly from Marywood or Hammersmith Farm, offering advice about Jackie's social life, expressing concern about her working for a newspaper, employment being slightly scandalous for someone of their class, urging her to remember who you are, a phrase that means remember your breeding, your education, your obligation to make an appropriate match rather than pursuing independence that might diminish her market value. The narrator reflects that journalism offers Jackie a temporary illusion of autonomy, a brief period when she is neither entirely under her mother's control nor yet attached to a husband's identity. She has a byline, earns her own money, however modest, moves through the city with professional purpose. Yet even here, the training from Chapin and Miss Porter's shapes what she can publish. The column must be light, charming, never too serious or political, maintaining the persona of an attractive young woman asking cute questions, rather than a reporter pursuing substantive stories. In May 1952, at a dinner party hosted by journalist Charles Bartlett and his wife Martha, Jackie met Representative John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. He is 35, handsome, despite chronic back problems and other health issues kept carefully hidden, ambitious in ways both obvious and concealed, recently profiled in the Saturday Evening Post as an eligible bachelor. She is 22, employed but underemployed, elegant but not quite sure where that elegance should take her. The meeting, later documented in multiple accounts and biographies, is deliberately arranged. The Bartletts have been trying to introduce them for months, believing they might suit each other, understanding that strategic matchmaking is one of the services friends provide for people of certain backgrounds and ambitions. The evening goes well enough that Jack asks for her phone number. She gives it, though friends later recall her expressing skepticism about whether he will actually call. He does call. They begin dating cautiously, fitting time together around his congressional duties and increasingly serious plans for a Senate run in 1952. Around her newspaper deadlines and social obligations. The courtship proceeds slowly, complicated by his absences and his reputation as someone not particularly interested in marriage, by her awareness that attachment to the Kennedy family would mean entering a political machine where privacy is impossible and image is everything. The narrator notes that at some point during these months, sitting at her dressing table late at night after another date, Jackie must have begun calculating, weighing his charm and intelligence and obvious trajectory toward power against the rumors about his womanizing, his poor health, his family's overwhelming intensity and ambition. The calculation is not cold or mercenary, but realistic, the kind of assessment women of her class and generation are taught to make. What am I getting? What am I giving up? What will this cost? What might it provide? The courtship between Jackie and John F. Kennedy, conducted across 1952 and into 1953, is documented in letters later collected and published, in contemporary gossip column items, in the reminiscences of friends who watched the relationship develop with interest and some concern. The documents reveal a woman weighing options with considerable sophistication, aware of both the opportunities and the costs inherent in marrying into the Kennedy family. Letters from this period show Jackie's characteristic wit and intelligence, her ability to be both warm and slightly distant, engaged but not desperate. She writes to friends about Jack with affection mixed with sharp observation, noting his charm while also commenting on his chronic lateness, his tendency to cancel plans at the last minute when political obligations intervene, the way Kennedy family gatherings seem to subsume individual identities into collective purpose. Biographers, particularly Carl Sferrazza Anthony in his detailed studies of Jackie's life, have argued that by the time she accepted Jack's proposal in the summer of 1953, she understood with clear eyes what she was entering. The Kennedy family's reputation was already well established, a father whose business dealings and political connections had made the family wealthy and influential, a mother whose Catholicism was intense and uncompromising, a collection of siblings who competed ferociously with each other while presenting united front to outsiders. More specifically, there were persistent rumors about Jack's personal life, his relationships with women, the pattern of behavior that suggested marriage would not mean fidelity. Some sources suggest that Jackie discussed this directly with friends, that she made a calculated decision that being married to an interesting, ambitious man who had affairs was preferable to being married to a boring, faithful one. As one friend later paraphrased, perhaps not with complete accuracy but capturing a certain truth, she saw infidelity as the price of admission to a life of significance rather than mere comfort. On an evening in the spring of 1953, in her apartment in Washington, she sits at her dressing table preparing for yet another date. She picks up one of Jack's notes. His handwriting is characteristically untidy, the script of someone who writes quickly without much attention to appearance, so different from her own careful formation of letters. She reads it, considers what it represents, then sets it aside and reaches for her dark sunglasses, studying her own reflection in the mirror. She's 23 years old, clever, socially adept, educated in multiple languages, and the subtle arts of managing appearances. She could marry someone safer, someone more conventionally faithful, someone whose ambitions are smaller and whose family is less overwhelming. But she has tasted both freedom, that Paris year, and limitation, watching other women from Miss Porter's settle into conventional marriages to conventional men, and she is choosing, with whatever reservations and anxieties, to attach her future to someone who offers the possibility of a larger stage. She picks up a note card from her desk, one of the monogrammed ones she has maintained since Miss Porter's, the same cream-colored paper she has used for hundreds of thank-you notes, and begins writing to a hostess from the previous weekend. The ritual is unchanged, even as the stakes of her life are rising dramatically. The pen moves in its familiar patterns, forming graceful letters that express perfect gratitude in perfect phrasing, while her mind works on calculations that have nothing to do with the surface content of the note. The narrator observes that the marriage, when it happens, will not be entered naively. It is a negotiated hope, an alliance in which Jackie will be simultaneously partner and ornament, political asset and private person, expected to maintain grace under conditions that will test that grace repeatedly. She is choosing this with open eyes, or at least with eyes as open as they can be, before the actual experience of living inside the Kennedy. Machinery. When Jack formally proposes, presenting her with a simple engagement ring, it will later be replaced by something larger and more expensive, more appropriate to Kennedy's status. She accepts knowing that she is committing not just to one man, but to a family, a political project, a level of public scrutiny that will make her newspaper job's modest visibility seem quaint in retrospect. The wedding plans begin immediately. It will be in Newport, at St. Mary's Catholic Church, followed by a reception at Hammersmith Farm. It will be large, hundreds of guests, multiple photographers, society page coverage. It will look, and is intended to look, like the union of two prominent families, the Bouvier and Auchinclosses on one side, the Kennedys on the other, money and ambition and Catholic respectability all perfectly displayed. On 12th of September 1953, 800 guests filled St. Mary's Church to watch Jackie walk down the aisle in an Anne Lowe gown of ivory silk taffeta, while the world's press captured the event as a social triumph. But in the private moments before the ceremony, and in the stack of thank-you notes waiting to be written at the reception, another story is already visible, the story of how much will be required to maintain the appearance of perfection and what the cost of that requirement will ultimately be. On 12th of September 1953, St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Newport, Rhode Island, filled with 800 guests for the wedding of Jacqueline Lee Bouvier to Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The church, built in Gothic Revival style with soaring arches and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the assembled crowd, provides appropriately grand staging for what society pages are already calling one of the year's most significant social events. Jackie walks down the aisle on the arm of her stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss. Her father, Jack Bouvier, who was supposed to give her away, has been too drunk to attend, a final humiliation in their complicated relationship, though the official story circulated to press is that he is ill. She wears a gown designed by Anne Lowe, one of the few prominent black designers of the era, though Lowe's identity is not mentioned in most contemporary coverage. The dress is ivory silk taffeta with a portrait neckline, a fitted bodice, and a bouffant skirt, traditional and elegant and exactly right for a woman who understands that this wedding is performance as much as sacrament. The reception on the lawn at Hammersmith Farm, where Jackie spent so many teenage summers learning to be an Auchincloss, unfolds with the kind of surface perfection that requires enormous hidden labor. An orchestra plays under white tents, Waiters circulate with champagne and lobster salad. Women in elaborate hats shield their eyes against the September sun reflecting off Narragansett Bay. The grounds have been manicured to perfection. Every flower bed tended, every lawn clipped, creating a setting that appears effortlessly beautiful while requiring an army of servants to maintain. Photographers from Life magazine, particularly Lisa Larson, capture the day in images that will be reproduced for decades. Jackie and Jack cutting the cake, the couple dancing, the bride tossing her bouquet. The photographs show a tableau of American success, wealth, beauty, political promise, all perfectly arranged. What they cannot show is the complexity beneath the surface. Jackie's awareness that she is marrying not just a man but a mythology, that the Kennedy family has already begun transforming her into a character in their narrative. Inside the house, away from the reception crowds, Jackie's old desk still stands in the room where she used to write letters during summers home from Miss Porter's. On that desk now sits a stack of embossed correspondence cards reading Mrs. John F. Kennedy, her new identity already printed and waiting, her maiden name about to be absorbed into her husband's, the independent byline of the inquiring camera girl, soon to be replaced by the title of senator's wife. She pauses in a side room, as described in the opening portrait, making the choice between dark sunglasses and fountain pen, between protecting herself and performing gratitude. She chooses the pen, begins the first of what will be hundreds, then thousands of thank you notes written over the course of her marriages, always in her careful script, always appropriately warm without being intimate, always maintaining the performance of grace, even when grace is the last thing she feels. The narrator reflects that Newport crystallizes both the promise and the bargain Jackie has made. In exchange for glamour and position, for access to power and the possibility of significance, she offers her composure to a family already expert at managing rumors and packaging image. She will be expected to look beautiful in photographs, to charm voters and donors, to produce Kennedy heirs, to never complain publicly about anything her husband does or fails to do. The terms are not written in any contract, but they are understood by everyone involved, including Jackie herself. Outside, the reception continues. Inside, she writes the first note of her married life, the pen moving in its practice patterns across cream-colored paper, forming letters that express gratitude she may or may not feel to people she may barely know, maintaining the rituals that have been drilled into her since childhood at Lasada and Chapin and Miss Porter's. The performance has begun, and it will continue, with very few breaks, for the next decade of her life. Within that decade, those same photographers who today capture her smiling beside Jack in Newport sunlight will follow her to Dallas, where she will ride in a different kind of procession, wearing a different pink outfit, with dark sunglasses waiting in her purse but not yet on her face, because the president has asked her to remove them so the crowds can see her clearly. The sunglasses on the table in Newport, dark, protective, enabling her to watch without being fully visible, are a technology she will need increasingly as the years pass and the demands of performance become more complex and costly. But for now, on this September afternoon, with 800 guests celebrating on the lawn and the orchestra playing under white tents and the champagne flowing and the future seeming bright with possibility, she bends over correspondence cards and begins writing thank you notes, maintaining the rituals of privilege, performing the role she has trained her entire life to play, even as some part of her already understands what that performance will require. When John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States on 20th of January 1961, Jacqueline Kennedy, at 31 years old, became the youngest First Lady since Frances Cleveland in the 1880s and the first to have been born in the 20th century. The role places her under a level of scrutiny unprecedented even in her years as senator's wife, transforming every choice she makes, from clothing to hairstyle to how she speaks, into subject of national commentary and debate. One of her first and most consequential decisions is to launch a comprehensive restoration of the White House, which she finds disappointingly generic when she moves in, furnished with reproduction pieces and decorated without historical coherence or aesthetic distinction. She appoints a fine arts committee, raises private funds, and begins the meticulous work of transforming the executive mansion into what she envisions as a showcase of American history and taste. The project is documented in memos, purchase records, and her own notes, all preserved in the Kennedy Library archives. She writes to museums requesting loans of period furniture, to donors soliciting contributions, to curators seeking expertise on authentication and provenance. The letters reveal her genuine knowledge and passion. This is not merely decorative busywork, but serious curatorial effort, applying the aesthetic education she received in Paris and the organizational skills she learned managing households to a project of national significance. In February 1962, CBS broadcast A Tour of the White House with Mrs. John F. Kennedy, a televised special that allowed her to present the restoration work to the American public. The hour-long program, preserved in network archives and later released on video, shows her moving through the newly restored rooms, explaining the history of furniture pieces and artworks in her characteristic soft, slightly breathy voice. Her performance is masterful, simultaneously knowledgeable and accessible, proud of the work without being boastful, making history feel intimate rather than remote. She speaks directly to the camera with the ease of someone who understands visual media instinctively, having learned through her newspaper, photography work how images communicate and what they conceal. The broadcast earns extraordinary ratings. 56 million Americans watch. She received an honorary Emmy Award, one of very few First Ladies to be recognized for media work. Yet the public success of the White House tour and the restoration project exists alongside private strains that are carefully hidden. After public receptions and state dinners, when the official photographs have been taken and the guests have departed, Jackie often retreats to a private sitting room on the second floor. She removes her dark sunglasses from her handbag. She has begun wearing them more frequently, both outdoors and in cars, creating a barrier between herself and the constant observation, and sits for a moment in silence before beginning the next round of correspondence. The letters she writes during White House years are preserved in multiple archives. Thank you notes to donors who have contributed furniture or funds for the restoration. Responses to curators who have assisted with authentication, carefully crafted messages to political allies and diplomatic contacts. Each letter serves multiple purposes: personal courtesy, political strategy, the maintenance of networks that support both the restoration project and Jack's broader political agenda. The narrator observes that in these years, grace becomes architecture in a literal sense. Jackie is using beauty and historical narrative to legitimize power, to make the presidency seem not just politically successful, but culturally sophisticated, to position the Kennedy administration as a break from Eisenhower-era conservatism towards something younger, more international, more intellectually engaged. The White House restoration is political work disguised as cultural work, and she performs it brilliantly. But the marriage beneath all this public success grows more complicated. Jack's infidelities, never entirely concealed during the courtship, become more frequent and more reckless in the White House. Secret Service agents, whose recollections are later published in various memoirs and investigative books, describe women being brought into the executive mansion during Jackie's absences, encounters in hotels during campaign trips, a pattern of behavior that treats marriage vows as purely public performance while private behavior follows entirely different rules. The pain this causes Jackie is documented obliquely in comments to friends, in the increasing frequency of her trips away from Washington to visit family or travel independently, in the dark sunglasses that appear more often in photographs from this period. She does not confront Jack publicly, does not threaten divorce, does not perform the role of wronged wife that tradition might assign her. Instead, she maintains the public performance of a contented First Lady while building a private life that requires less proximity to behaviors she can neither change nor accept. Behind the closed doors of Georgetown townhouses and in the whispered gossip that circulates in certain Washington circles, another story runs parallel to the public one: the president's affairs with White House staffers, with Hollywood figures including Marilyn Monroe, with women whose names will be documented only decades later when aging Secret Service agents and former staffers break their silence. The story is known but not reported, visible but not acknowledged, maintained through a complex conspiracy of discretion that includes not just Jackie's silence, but the silence of journalists who have evidence but choose not to publish it, of staff members who witness but do not testify, of a culture that considers presidential masculinity and sexual conquest as somehow linked, acceptable, even admirable. By the early 1960s, Jack Kennedy's relationships with other women have become what later historical accounts describe as an open secret in certain circles of Washington society, known to journalists who choose not to report it, to Secret Service agents who witness it, to staff members who facilitate it, to political allies who consider it irrelevant to his effectiveness as president. The silence surrounding these relationships represents a different social contract than would exist in later decades, when political leaders' private behavior becomes considered relevant to their public character. FBI files, later released under Freedom of Information Act requests and cited extensively in biographies by Seymour Hersh and others, document the Bureau's awareness of Jack's relationships and their concerns about security implications, particularly regarding women with possible foreign connections. Secret Service recollections, published in memoirs and interviews decades after the fact, describe their role in facilitating presidential encounters while protecting Jackie from knowledge or confrontation. The relationship between Jack and Marilyn Monroe, in particular, has been extensively documented through phone records, witness testimonies, and Monroe's own comments to friends and therapists. Their encounters in 1961 and 1962, including her famous performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President, at Madison Square Garden in May 1962, represent behavior that is simultaneously reckless in its visibility and protected by collective willingness to maintain official fictions. Sources, including Sarah Bradford's biography of Jackie and documentation from Jackie's confidants, suggest that she was aware of the pattern and had made peace with it in her own way. She reportedly told a friend, in a comment later widely circulated, though impossible to verify with complete certainty, that she could face being married to a philanderer more easily than being married to a bore. The quote, if genuine, reveals a certain pragmatism, a calculation that an interesting husband who strays is preferable to a faithful husband who offers nothing beyond fidelity. On a humid evening in the summer of 1962, after a state dinner has concluded and guests have departed, Jackie sits at her narrow desk in the White House residence. She has already made her appearance downstairs in a silk gown designed specifically for the evening, has stood beside Jack receiving guests, has performed the role of First Lady with her characteristic poise. Now, alone in the private quarters, she reaches for her sunglasses, which she has left on the desk blotter, considers them for a moment, then instead picks up blue-tinted personal stationery to write to her sister Lee about her recent diplomatic trip to India and Pakistan. The letter, portions of which have been preserved and quoted in biographies, discusses cultural observations, amusing encounters with foreign dignitaries, the exhausting schedule of public appearances and private meetings. What it does not discuss is the strain of the marriage, the rumors she knows are circulating, the anger or hurt or resignation she may feel about Jack's behavior. The silence is strategic. Even in private correspondence with her sister, she maintains certain boundaries, recognizes that written words can be preserved, and later discovered that complete honesty on paper is dangerous for someone in her position. The narrator reflects that her refusal to engage publicly with rumors about Jack's infidelities is not simple passivity or denial. It is strategic silence, a calculated decision that preserving her children's image of their father and maintaining the administration's political capital matters more than her own emotional transparency or the satisfaction of confrontation. The choice costs her in stress, in suppressed anger, in the need to perform contentment while experiencing something quite different privately. But it is a conscious choice made with full awareness of alternatives and their consequences. Behind this choice lies the understanding, drilled into her since childhood at Miss Porter's and reinforced through years as senator's and then president's wife, that women of her class and position serve larger purposes than their own happiness. She is not just Jack's wife, but the First Lady, not just a woman but a symbol, not just herself but a character in a national narrative. Her job is to maintain the performance regardless of what that performance costs her privately. The cost of that choice, the accumulation of suppressed feeling, the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the loneliness of living inside a marriage that functions beautifully in public while remaining hollow in private, will become unbearable only when loss arrives, not as betrayal, but as violence, not as disappointment, but as death, not as something she can manage through silence, but as something that shatters all the careful structures she has built. But for now, in the summer of 1962, she writes to her sister about India, the pen moving across blue paper in her careful script, maintaining the letters and rituals that have structured her life since those early afternoons at La Sata, when she first learned that words on paper could create acceptable versions of more complicated realities. Outside her window, Washington's summer heat presses down on the city. Inside, she performs grace through writing, choosing what to record and what to omit, what to preserve and what to burn, constructing through correspondence a version of her life that can be shared while the full truth remains carefully concealed. On 7th of August 1963, at Otis Air Force Base Hospital on Cape Cod, Jackie gave birth prematurely to Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, the couple's third child and second son. The baby, born 5.5 weeks early by emergency cesarean section, weighs only 4 pounds, 10 ounces, and suffers from hyaline membrane disease, a respiratory condition affecting premature infants before modern treatments became available. Hospital records and contemporary press reports describe the desperate medical efforts to save Patrick, placement in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber at Boston Children's Hospital, consultation with the nation's top pediatric specialists, round-the-clock care. Jack, reportedly, stays at the hospital for most of the 39 hours Patrick survives, an unusual display of emotional engagement from a man who typically maintains distance from personal crisis. Jackie, recovering from surgery, cannot be with her son when he dies on 9 August. The grief is real, documented in letters Jackie writes to friends in the weeks afterward, in Jack's own visible distress, in the small private funeral at Cardinal Cushing's residence before Patrick's burial at Holyoke Cemetery in Brookline. His remains would later be moved to Arlington to rest near his father. The loss affects both parents profoundly, though they process it differently. Jack throws himself back into work. Jackie retreats into private mourning. Photographs from Hyannisport that late summer show Jackie wearing her dark, oversized sunglasses even on overcast days, creating a physical barrier between her grief and the press photographers who continue to track her movements. Sunglasses, practical accessories for years, have become more essential now, tools of emotional survival as much as fashion statements, ways of maintaining some small zone of privacy in a life that has almost none. The marriage, some sources suggest, improved slightly in the aftermath of Patrick's death. Jack is more attentive, more present, perhaps genuinely moved by shared grief, or perhaps simply guilty about his absences and affairs. There is talk of Jackie accompanying him on more political trips, of the family spending more time together. These plans will be cut short. 3 months and 13 days after Patrick's death, on November 1963, Jackie rode in an open Lincoln Continental through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, wearing a pink Chanel-style suit, actually made by Chez Nignon in New York, and matching pillbox hat. The weather is sunny. The crowds are enthusiastic. Texas Governor John Connolly's wife turns to comment that you certainly can't say Dallas doesn't love you. Jackie is smiling, waving, performing the role of First Lady on a political trip designed to shore up support in a state where Kennedy faces serious challenges. Newsreel footage and amateur film, particularly the Zapruder film that will be analyzed frame by frame for decades, capture what happens next. The crack of rifle fire, Jack's body jerking forward, then back, Jackie's desperate scramble onto the trunk of the limousine reaching for something. A piece of skull, though she will later not remember this clearly. Secret Service agent Clint Hill climbing onto the car, the motorcade speeding to Parkland Hospital where doctors will pronounce the president dead. In the hours and days that follow, Jackie remains largely silent in public but intensely active in managing how Jack's death will be remembered. She refuses to change out of the blood-stained pink suit, reportedly saying, "Let them see what they've done." She insists on walking behind the coffin in the funeral procession, a breach of security protocol but powerful symbolically. She lights an eternal flame at his grave at Arlington National Cemetery, creating a permanent memorial. On 29 November 1963, a week after the assassination, she granted an interview to journalist Theodore White for Life magazine, later published in heavily edited form. In that conversation, preserved in transcripts and White's notes now available in archives, she creates the Camelot narrative, comparing Jack's presidency to the brief, shining moment described in the musical, framing 1,000 days in office as a golden age, cut tragically short. The framing is deliberate myth-making, using cultural reference to elevate political reality, choosing romance over the more complicated truth of the administration's actual achievements and failures. The narrator observes that in the space between Patrick's death in August and Dallas in November, the rituals that once concealed marital strain, the perfect clothes, the composed public appearances, the careful performance of First Lady duties become tools of survival. Grace, once deployed to maintain political image, now serves to hold together her own shattered reality and to shape how a nation processes collective trauma. She has performed Grace under many kinds of pressure: childhood divorce, difficult marriage, public scrutiny. But this is different. This is performance under conditions of genuine catastrophe, maintaining composure not to protect image, but because breakdown is unthinkable, because she has children who need her to remain functional, because millions of Americans are watching and need her to model how to endure the unendurable. When the immediate shock recedes, the questions of how she and her children will live, who will protect them, and who will pay for that protection will bring issues of money and security into even sharper focus, will force her to make calculations about survival that have nothing to do with grace or performance and everything to do with raw pragmatism about power and resources. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, Jackie's financial situation becomes complex, shaped by Kennedy family trusts, her late husband's estate, and the peculiarities of how presidential wealth is structured and protected. Probate documents and financial histories, cited in various biographies and investigative accounts, suggest her income from Kennedy sources is approximately $200,000 annually in mid-1960s dollars. Substantial, but not, by the standards of extreme wealth, enormous. The Kennedy fortune is held in trusts established by Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., distributed among his children and grandchildren according to structures designed to minimize taxes and maintain family control. Publicly, in the months and years following Dallas, Jackie moves between Georgetown, where she rents a house in an attempt to establish stable residence for Carolyn and John, Hyannisport, where the Kennedy compound offers family support and security, and eventually New York, where she settles more permanently. She is photographed constantly, leaving homes, entering cars, walking with her children in Central Park, attending ballet performances and gallery openings. The oversized dark sunglasses become her most recognizable feature, appearing in virtually every photograph, creating a barrier between her face and the cameras that never stop clicking. The paparazzi attention is unprecedented and relentless. Photographers follow her children to school, stake out her apartment building, pursue her car through Manhattan traffic. The level of intrusion is traumatic, particularly for someone who has spent years carefully managing her public image and now finds that management impossible, that she is photographed whether she wants to be or not, that no amount of grace or composure can stop the cameras. When Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated on 5th of June 1968 while seeking the Democratic presidential nomination, Jackie's fear for her own children's safety becomes urgent and explicit. Her remark to friends after Robert's death, "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country," is preserved in multiple biographical sources and reflects genuine terror about political violence that seems to be targeting her family specifically. This fear shapes her decision to marry Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate whom she has known socially for years. The marriage, which takes place on 20th October 1968 on Onassis's private island of Skorpios in Greece, provokes widespread criticism. From the Catholic Church, Onassis is divorced, making the marriage problematic under church law. From many Americans who feel she is betraying Jack's memory. From commentators who frame the union as purely mercenary. Jackie O. marrying for money. The financial arrangements of the Onassis marriage are extensively documented in later legal proceedings and biographical accounts. She reportedly receives $3 million upon marriage. Some sources say $2 million, others more, with additional allowances for expenses, clothing, and maintenance. More significantly, the marriage offers what money can buy: private islands where paparazzi cannot follow, security teams to protect her children, the ability to simply leave the United States and its political violence and its relentless press coverage. The narrator reflects that financial arrangements cannot erase betrayal or trauma. No amount of money can resurrect Jack or Robert, can restore the years lost to grief, and can undo the sight of her husband's blood on her pink suit. But money does buy options: the possibility of withdrawal from public life, the ability to refuse interviews and appearances, the physical security that allows her children to grow up without constant threat. In later years, when critics condemn her for marrying for money, they miss or ignore the calculation underneath. Jackie is converting Onassis's wealth into protection and autonomy for her children, trading her own reputation, which she understands will suffer from the marriage, for Carolyn and John's safety and freedom from the Kennedy political machinery. The bargain is strategic, perhaps cold in its pragmatism, but it serves purposes she considers more important than maintaining the image of grieving widow. On Skorpios in October 1968, boarding Onassis's yacht Christina in her now iconic oversized sunglasses, wearing simple clothes and no makeup in photographs that appear in newspapers and magazines worldwide, Jackie completes a transformation that has been building since Dallas. She is no longer the president's widow, no longer primarily a Kennedy, no longer bound by the obligations that came with that identity. She is becoming someone else, using marriage not for love or status, though both may be present to some degree, but as a transaction that purchases something she needs more than romance: distance, protection, the ability to control some portion of her own life. The Greek islands, the yacht, the ability to travel without constantly being recognized and pursued, these become more valuable than maintaining American approval. She accepts being called Jackie O with disdain by the American press because being Jackie O means not being the First Lady, not being the widow, not being trapped in a role that has consumed her identity for years. The marriage to Onassis lasted until his death in 1975, 7 years during which she divided time between Greece and New York, between public appearances with her husband and increasingly independent life raising her children, and beginning, tentatively, to imagine herself as something other than wife, widow, symbol. The marriage is complicated, reportedly strained by Onassis's ongoing relationship with opera singer Maria Callas and by fundamental incompatibilities, but it provides the breathing room she needs to begin constructing a post-White House identity on her own terms. The marriage to Aristotle Onassis, formalized on 20 October 1968, on his private island of Skorpios in a Greek Orthodox ceremony that satisfies neither Jackie's Catholic faith nor the expectations of Americans who believe presidential widows should remain eternally devoted to dead husbands' memories, provides her with something she has rarely experienced since childhood: substantial periods of time when she is not performing for American audiences, when she can be relatively anonymous despite her fame, when the cameras that do follow her are at least distant, rather than immediately intrusive. Catholic leaders, including Cardinal Cushing, who has been close to the Kennedy family, expressed disappointment publicly about the marriage. Newspapers and magazines run critical commentary comparing her unfavorably to other presidential widows who remained unmarried and devoted to their late husbands' legacies. The criticism is often explicitly about money. She is portrayed as mercenary, as having betrayed genuine grief for Greek wealth, as being bought by a man known for his ruthless business dealings and his ostentatious displays of wealth. Yet the marriage also gives her distance from American politics and, crucially, from the threat she genuinely believes hangs over her children. On Scorpios and on Onassis's yacht, Christina, Caroline, and John can swim and play with more freedom than they have ever known, protected by geography and security, rather than constantly guarded against potential assassination. This alone, by Jackie's calculation, justifies the marriage and the criticism it generates. As Onassis's health declines through the early 1970s and their relationship frays under the strain of incompatible expectations and Onassis's ongoing connection to Maria Callas, Jackie spends increasing time in New York City. She purchases an apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue overlooking Central Park, establishes stable residence for Caroline, now at college, and John, in high school, and begins tentatively exploring what employment might mean for someone of her background and celebrity. In 1975, she took a position as consulting editor at Viking Press, the beginning of a career in book publishing that would occupy the last 2 decades of her life. When Onassis died in March 1975, Greek inheritance law limited what a foreign widow could claim from his estate. After lengthy legal negotiations with Onassis's daughter Christina, Jackie accepts a settlement reported as $26 million, waiving all further claims to the Onassis fortune. Colleagues at Viking, and later at Doubleday, where she moves in 1978 after Viking publishes a novel she finds offensive, remember her arriving at the office in large sunglasses and low heels, carrying marked-up manuscripts in her bag, moving quietly through cubicles, working seriously, despite the oddity of a former First Lady in a mid-level editorial position. She acquires books on subjects that interest her: ballet, photography, history, preservation, and develops genuine relationships with authors who appreciate her editorial suggestions and her ability to smooth publication processes through her connections. The narrator observes that editing allows Jackie finally to participate in shaping narratives that are not her own or about her. After decades of being written about, analyzed, photographed, and interpreted, she becomes someone who helps others choose their words and structure their stories. The power is modest compared to being First Lady, but it is real, and it is hers in ways that her previous influence was always mediated through men and institutions. She works on books about architecture and art history, about cultural preservation and dance, subjects that have interested her since Paris, but that she could never pursue professionally while married to a politician and then to a shipping magnate. The salary is small. She does not need money by this point, having both the Onassis settlement and Kennedy Trust income. But the work provides identity and routine, structures her days around something other than being Jackie Kennedy or Jackie Onassis. In her Fifth Avenue apartment, she creates a private world that reflects her own taste rather than political necessity or husbandly preference. She collects books, hangs art she has chosen, hosts small dinners for friends from publishing and arts worlds. The space is elegant but not ostentatious, comfortable rather than grand, designed for living rather than entertaining. Caroline and John grow up, marry, and have children of their own. Jackie becomes a grandmother, a role she approaches with the same mixture of warmth and privacy that has characterized her parenting. She's photographed occasionally with grandchildren in Central Park, still wearing the oversized sunglasses that have become her trademark, still maintaining boundaries between public visibility and private experience. When she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma in January 1994, she initially kept the illness private, continuing to work at Doubleday even as she underwent treatment. Only when the cancer progresses and treatment options are exhausted does she acknowledge publicly that she is dying. She died on 19th of May 1994 in her Fifth Avenue apartment, surrounded by her children and a few close friends. She is 64 years old. Obituaries in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and newspapers worldwide emphasize not scandal or tragedy, but her grace under pressure, her work on historic preservation, her second career in publishing. The narrative is shifted. She is remembered not primarily as a victim or widow, but as someone who survived trauma and built a meaningful life afterward. Her estate, estimated at approximately $150 million largely from investments in the Onassis settlement, passes to Caroline and John according to a will that reveals decades of careful financial planning. The Kennedy Library and various museums request items for preservation and exhibition. Clothing, letters, photographs, the material artifacts of a life lived at the intersection of beauty, power, and enforced performance. In the years following Jackie's death in 1994, exhibitions at the Kennedy Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Historical Society, and fashion museums across the country display the physical artifacts of her life, the clothing she wore, the letters she wrote, the objects she touched and used and left behind when she died. The most famous artifact, the pink Chanel-style suit she wore in Dallas, stained with her husband's blood, is held by the National Archives under agreement that it will not be publicly displayed until at least 2103. The decision to keep it from view reflects understanding that some objects carry too much trauma to be casually exhibited, that the suit is not fashion history, but evidence of national wound still not fully healed decades later. Other items are more accessible, the pillbox hats that became her signature during the White House years, though ironically the specific hat she wore in Dallas was lost in the chaos after the assassination. The evening gowns designed by Oleg Cassini and other couturiers, the simple shift dresses she favored for daytime. Fashion historians analyze her style's evolution from debutante elegance through First Lady formality to the more relaxed but still refined aesthetic of her later years. But increasingly, exhibitions focus on her papers, letters, notes, working drafts of speeches, and White House tour scripts, the correspondence through which she managed so much of her life. These documents, preserved in archives and occasionally sold at auction for substantial sums, reveal the woman behind the image, witty, intelligent, occasionally sharp, always aware of audience and purpose. In museum vitrines, visitors lean over to read facsimiles of letters she wrote at various ages, schoolgirl notes from Miss Porter's, early letters to Jack during their courtship, official First Lady correspondence on White House letterhead, editorial notes to authors she worked with at Doubleday. The handwriting is immediately recognizable, clear, controlled, elegant, the careful formation of letters she learned as a child and maintained throughout her life. The same hand that wrote pleading notes to her father from Lasata, that wrote thank you cards at Hammersmith Farm, that filled out inquiring camera girl columns in cheap notebooks, that composed official statements as First Lady, that signed book contracts as an editor. That hand now rests, preserved in ink on paper, available for strangers to study and interpret decades after the woman who wielded the pen has died. The narrator reflects that the architecture of privilege that both confined and protected Jackie survives in these artifacts, in this careful curation of a life that was always simultaneously private experience and public performance. Visitors looking at her dresses see beauty and craftsmanship. They may not see the constraint those dresses represent, the requirement that she always look perfect, that her appearance serve purposes larger than her own comfort or preference. The letters reveal more of the complexity, the wit that could be sharp without being cruel, the intelligence that found careful ways to express itself within the boundaries of appropriate femininity, the strategy that calculated relationships and obligations with precision while maintaining surface warmth. Reading her correspondence, one sees both genuine feeling and controlled performance, often in the same sentence, often impossible to fully separate. The oversized dark sunglasses, which appear in countless photographs from the 1960s onward and have been donated to various collections, become perhaps the most symbolic artifact. They are simultaneously fashionable and functional, style and shield, the perfect emblem of someone who must be visible but wants to protect something of herself from constant observation. The continuing fascination with Jackie, the biographies published every few years, the dramatic portrayals in film and television, the auction prices for her possessions, the tourism to sites associated with her life reveals something about American culture's relationship to beauty, tragedy, and female performance. She becomes, in death even more than in life, a canvas onto which people project their own ideas about grace under pressure, about maintaining dignity in impossible circumstances, about what women owe to public expectation versus what they owe to themselves. What remains unresolved in all this attention and analysis is the question the artifacts cannot definitively answer. How much of Jackie's legendary grace was performance imposed by circumstance and training, and how much was authentic expression of her actual character? The question may be unanswerable, may be the wrong question entirely. Perhaps what matters is not whether the performance was real, but that it was maintained so successfully for so long under such difficult conditions that she found ways to preserve some private self while giving so much of herself to public consumption. Her children, who survive her and continue to guard her privacy as she would have wanted, occasionally speak about her in interviews but generally maintain the discretion she taught them. Caroline, in particular, seems to have inherited both her mother's intelligence and her understanding of how to navigate public attention while protecting private life. John, before his own death in a plane crash in 1999, demonstrated similar skills at managing fame while attempting to build independent identity. The grandchildren she knew and the great-grandchildren she never met carry forward a legacy more complicated than any museum. Exhibition can fully capture beauty and tragedy, privilege and constraint, public service and private cost all tangled together in ways that resist simple interpretation or judgment. They inherit not just money and social position, but the more ambiguous inheritance of being connected to American mythology, of having their lives read as symbols before they are understood as simply human experiences. In a dim museum storeroom, away from the curated galleries where tourists and scholars examine the public artifacts of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's life, a conservator opens a shallow archival drawer lined with acid-free tissue paper. Inside lie 2 items tagged with catalog numbers and careful condition notes. A pair of large dark sunglasses from the early 1960s, the tortoise-shell frames showing wear at the hinges where they were folded and unfolded thousands of times, and a silver-capped fountain pen with a blue barrel, its nib still faintly stained with old ink that has dried to brown. No label explains which specific days these objects were used, which letters the pen wrote, or which streets the sunglasses shielded her from seeing or being seen. Perhaps they were used on a balcony in Paris in 1950, when she was still Jacqueline Bouvier, studying abroad and finding the happiest freedom she would ever experience. Perhaps in Dallas on a sunnier moment before the motorcade, when she put the sunglasses in her purse because Jack asked her to remove them so the crowds could see her face clearly. Perhaps at a New York desk in the 1980s, editing someone else's manuscript about art history or dance, finding satisfaction in shaping narratives that were not her own. The objects themselves do not testify to their specific use. They exist now only as preserved artifacts, material evidence of a life that touched so many moments and carried so many meanings that no single interpretation can capture their full significance. But seen together in this drawer, resting side by side in museum storage, they suggest the dual nature of that life, the desire to shield and the compulsion to record, the need to hide one's eyes while simultaneously leaving a trace in ink, the tension between protecting the self and communicating with others. The sunglasses, dark and oversized, in the style that became iconic in photographs from the 1960s and 1970s, represent one strategy for navigating fame. Create a barrier, maintain a boundary, allow yourself to watch the world without the world watching all of you. They are tools of privacy in a life that had almost none, small pieces of armor against the constant observation that came with being First Lady, President's widow, international celebrity. The fountain pen represents a different strategy: engagement through careful control, communication through precisely chosen words, connection maintained through letters that express appropriate feelings while revealing nothing that might be used against you. The pen is the tool through which she managed relationships and obligations, expressed gratitude and maintained networks, shaped narratives and protected children, and translated complex emotions into acceptable social performances. Together, they embody the contradiction of Jackie's life, the simultaneous need for privacy and visibility, for protection and connection, for authentic self and performed identity. She could not refuse to be visible. Her position, her fame, her role all demanded constant appearance in public. But she could control, to some degree, what that visibility revealed, could use sunglasses and carefully composed letters to maintain zones of privacy within the goldfish bowl of celebrity and power. The conservator, handling the objects with gloved hands, notes their condition in the preservation log and closes the drawer. The items will remain in controlled storage, their temperature and humidity carefully monitored to slow degradation, available for exhibition if requested, but mostly resting in darkness, waiting for scholars and curators who might want to study them, who might see in a pair of sunglasses and a fountain pen the material evidence of how one woman navigated impossible demands. The camera, if we imagine this still as film, as the opening portrait suggested, does not follow the conservator out of the storeroom or track back to the public galleries where visitors examine evening gowns and read wall text about White House restoration. Instead, it holds on the closed drawer on the metal filing system that contains hundreds of such drawers, each holding fragments of lives and moments that have been deemed significant enough to preserve, but not significant enough to constantly display. The viewer is left with the quiet question those objects pose when considered together. How much of Jacqueline Kennedy's legendary grace was performance imposed by family, by social position, by the roles of senator's wife and first lady and president's widow? How much was strategic choice, conscious decision to use performance as protection, to deploy beauty and manners and carefully calibrated public presentation as tools for managing situations she could not control? And how much was simply her own authentic character, the person she would have been regardless of circumstance, someone who found genuine pleasure in beauty and order and carefully chosen words? The question cannot be definitively answered from artifacts in drawers, from letters in archives, from photographs in galleries. Perhaps it cannot be answered at all. Perhaps the attempt to separate performance from authenticity in a life like hers is fundamentally misguided, based on false assumptions about how identity works when you are always watched, always judged, always required to represent something larger than yourself. What remains is the evidence, the sunglasses and the pen, the letters and the photographs, the dresses and the recordings, all the material traces of a life lived at the intersection of beauty, power, privilege, and constraint. The artifacts speak in their mute material way, offering fragments of truth without resolving into simple narrative, preserving grace while also preserving the questions about what that grace concealed and what it cost to maintain.